एकली जातोड़ो पटाड़ू माना वो जानी मनी देख ले खड़ी नीम के नीचे
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. A special thanks to Aniket sir and Leaf for giving me this opportunity to provide an overview of landscape architecture in India to set forth a tone for the conversations that follow. This will be done in two parts. Today, we will be looking at the beginnings, education, pedagogy, and ethics. The Indian subcontinent's unique geography and diverse cultures have played an important role in shaping our taste and sensibilities pertaining to art and design. They have often pointed to the role of nature and designed outdoor environs towards well-being of land and the individual. The creators of these spaces have traditionally been associated with the act of planting, making gardens, reading sites to know its soil and water capabilities. The notion of creating an outdoor space was also infused with ideas derived from philosophy, cosmology, mythology, used symbolism and metaphor as modes of communicating the value of these design spaces and wilderness. It could be said that there was never really a designer or maker of open spaces, but it was more seen as a duty of a society to steward, nurture, protect, and engage with land and its natural systems. There was a sense of gratitude and deep appreciation for land. That is the premise upon which our relationship with land rests. Profession of landscape architecture, landscape design, and landscape planning, as we see it today, was never a grand singular idea, but a collective of many threads, many hands, and minds over the centuries. Every region, due to its distinct biogeographical factors, had its own design idiom of garden cultures and spatial expressions. The medieval period saw an explosion of garden styles such as the Mughal, Deccani, Vijayanagara, Rajputana, to name a few, and alongside that, consciously looked at land management strategies. Invasion and colonization at a subcontinent scale has been a recurrent event in history, which has influenced and subsumed many of these nuances in favor of a common way of looking at land systems and garden traditions. In the modern era, early semblances of engagement with garden can be traced to the efforts of a few foresters, ecologists, geographers, and botanists. Under the patronage of Crown rule, the intent was limited to exploring and mapping the subcontinent's landscape, seeking economic gain and medical advancement and resource evaluation. The creation of forest acts disenfranchised local communities dependent on the forest and diverted these resources for the growing industrial needs. The idea of conservation, experimenting with plant material for agroeconomic gain, led to the setting up of botanical gardens in the subcontinent. Over the years, with trained superintendents, especially from Kew, these gardens opened their doors towards use as public spaces. The propagation and availability of plants triggered the idea of using exotic plants in private gardens, a space which was till then largely utilitarian in purpose. In years to come, these gardens and their Q-trained superintendents set forth points of reference in a manner in which the outdoor spaces should be designed and managed. The prestigious position of superintendents of public gardens by the 1940s came to be occupied by Q-trained Indians who were committed to the core principles outlined by the previous generations, but also diversified the role and responsibilities of these gardens. They continued to create spaces within these public parks with horticultural exuberance and occasionally added to the expressions of spatial design. Some of them also took up commissions for patrons. The period from 1947 to 1971 was of great political churn, deeply connected to the birth of nationalism and the idea of nation. This period saw major geopolitical restructuring and setting up of planning commissions, establishment of capitals, administrative centers, institutes, rural development centers, and infrastructure resource creation. It was a crucial time for the young nations to demonstrate economic growth and capability. There was tremendous need for skilled architects, planners, and engineers, which brought in many international names and our very own to instill the idea of nationalism through architecture, which was true to Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. Nepal, a country that was never colonized, also opened its valley for development to keep up with its neighbors. Sri Lanka was well on its way towards a more rooted expression of modernism. The 50s also saw establishment of many architecture courses across the country as extensions to their art schools to equip the nation in the years to come. These were crucial steps to address the need within the country. The natural landscape around this time was seen more as a resource meant to be tapped for infrastructure growth and food security. The advent of national highway programs, creation of hydroelectric stations and dams, agricultural policies with heavy emphasis on rapid gain, the use of exotics like prosopis for rapid biomass generation and greening, and import of seeds were some of the common events throughout the subcontinent. Architecture and urban development were taking strides. To match their pace, barring a few individuals, botanical gardens were seen as immediate resource centers. It was during this time the horticultural departments were formulated alongside agricultural departments whose directions were now very different. The horticultural departments were now tasked with the responsibility of creating parks and open spaces, setting up nurseries, propagating and distributing plants, greening up cities, etc. The industrial townships, factories, power stations, and campuses had an open space component which was largely dealt by them. There was an evident gap. It was around this time the country saw its first generation of landscape architects. Armed with education from England, America, and France, they brought in various sensibilities and uncompromised ethics of working with land. Through their works, they demonstrated various capabilities of a landscape architect. Professor Ram Sharma, architect with Masters in Landscape Architecture and Masters in Architecture, introduced a whole new capability of planning and design. Through his work, he demonstrated an integrated approach of architecture at the level of site and civic open spaces. His works also include the design of scenic highways executed as per his meticulously drawn plans. The process involved painstaking mapping and exhaustive studies of topography, geology, hydrology, forest cover, and scenic quality. This was uncharted ground for a landscape architect in India, the first of a kind which looked at ecological basis for aligning roads in a landscape. Architect Ravindra Bhan wanted to be a cinematographer. Eventually, he found his way to architecture and studied landscape architecture later on at UPenn. He worked with McHarg and introduced the McHargian method of meticulous land suitability analysis in times when data was inadequate. He believed that this method was the most scientific when it came to working with land and was the way forward. Professor Prabhakar Bhagwat nurtured his love for plants under his father Balchandra Bhagwat, a superintendent at the Pune Empress Botanical Gardens. He studied landscape architecture under Brian Hackett at Newcastle upon Tyne. His knowledge of plants, plant ecology, and the manner in which simple ecological actions can be applied to revive ecosystems has been demonstrated across his works. Architect Kishore Pradhan, with a master's in landscape architecture and horticulture from France, advocated attention to open spaces and their role in enlivening a city. Apart from private commissions, he worked extensively on parks and public spaces, especially in Mumbai and Hyderabad. He believed for the profession to be noticed, it has to work more in the public realm. His practice was very crucial in dense cities like Mumbai, which was rapidly depleting its open spaces and connect with nature. Architect Satish Khanna, with masters in landscape from the University of Pennsylvania, worked under McHarg before setting up his practice in India. At an early stage, he brought an entirely new understanding to the capabilities of profession in providing directions for land development, especially at very large scales through environmental assessments, siting tactics, and natural resource management. Professor Shahir, a trained architect, urban designer, and landscape architect, played a significant role in the subsequent years by lending the profession with a whole new vocabulary to design and many lenses to understand, appreciate, and introspect about the profession. His work in the realm of historic sites, memorials, and public parks brought about a new understanding of landscape architects' capability in conservation and urbanism. Thus, the first generation showed us various ways of engaging in practice and the many directions it can offer. They also helped further the profession by setting up academic programs, teaching in them, and writing extensively. Most importantly, they brought dignity very early on. There was a voice now, that of a landscape architect. It demonstrated unique capability and skills that address land, open spaces, and the interstices between the buildings. This helped lay foundation to the profession, its pedagogy, sensibilities, and possibilities of praxis. The subsequent generations have shown immense responsibility in forging the trajectory of the profession in many directions by constantly pushing the ambit and expanding the role of the landscape architect. This was achieved through consistent efforts and high professional standards in demonstrating capabilities. Today, there are about 15 schools with master's program, about 100 odd practices, and about 700 landscape architects in the country. This was achieved over the past 50 years due to the consistent efforts of a few. But the rising numbers also see a huge gap between education and practice, perhaps due to lack of inspiring teachers and an outdated curriculum. A curriculum that doesn't acknowledge works within the country and the challenges that the profession faces in present times. Though some courses have evolved to keep pace with the present global trajectory, a few others seem to struggle. Establishing credibility still seems to be a recurrent process for every new entrant into practice, whether it be for a small garden or a large master plan. This is one of the greatest hurdles that ought to be overcome for a profession that is now more than 50 years old, that is capable of bringing sheer delight to the everyday as well as offering solutions to the larger regional problems pertaining to land across scale and beyond boundaries.
Good evening, namaste everyone. Thank you so much, Aniket sir and Leaf Foundation for organizing this series. I'm happy to discuss the Nepalese landscapes on a larger level, which will be followed by Ms. Ruchi Bajracharya in detail. Nepal is a landlocked country nestled in the foothills of Himalayas. It is located in South Asia with China in the north and India in south, east, and west. The country can be divided into three main geographical regions: Himalayan region, hilly region, and the Tarai region. The highest point in the country is Mount Everest, 8,848 meter, while the lowest point is in the Tarai plains of Kechanakalan in Japa, 60 meter. Because of this vast difference in altitude, naturally Nepal consists of beautiful Himalayan ranges, serene hills, forests, ridges, valleys, lakes, wetlands, rivers, ponds, etc. It is recorded that Nepal has a total of 118 types of ecosystem, 75 vegetation, and 35 types of forest. The mountains and wetlands or forest create a series of visual characters and trigger different experiences. These experiences always inspires us for the designs responding to the grandeurs of majestic mountains, amazing layers formed in the contours of hills, textures formed due to stacking of the sheets of natural rocks of caves, and the platforms created on the fields of Tarai plains. Just a quick look of Bundol chaur farping. A chaur in the middle of the dense forest inspires with its diversity and ecosystem along the series of vista created naturally. Dense forest open up to a meadow chaur, forming a series of experiences of prospect and refuge, which creates a sense of mystery. With these, of course, these landscapes for us is a complete book for ecological designs. The government of Nepal in 2016 has declared conservation program in 5 landscapes. Tarai Arc landscape for tiger conservation, Chiton Annapurna landscape as a river basin linking habitats at different altitudes, Kailash sacred landscape for its cultural attributes, sacred Himalayan landscapes for its cultural and ecological attributes. Kanchenjunga landscape is a transboundary landscape that includes habitats at altitudes ranging from lowland Tarai in Japa district to the high mountains of Kanchenjunga. Under these landscapes, altogether there are 12 national parks. The green corridors, forest covers, and the rivers and wetlands in these national parks are the home for different habitats. These national parks are in protected areas under landscape scale conservation, which contributes to transboundary conservation of biodiversity, which enables collaboration and coordinated effort in to fight poaching, illegal international trade, and conserving these in its natural form. Because of its wide ranges of physiographic division of the country, it is estimated that there are in total 6,000 rivers, including rivulets and tributaries, in Nepal. Historically, the civilization of most of the cities of Nepal started from the bank of the rivers, for example, Seti River of Pokhara city, Narayani River of Bharatpur city, Danda River of Bhairua city, Tinau River of Butol city, and Bagmati River of Kathmandu Valley. Bagmati River, which was once the origin of the civilization of Kathmandu Valley, is now acting as the urban void between the two municipalities of city. The river originally was the main resource of the people residing in Kathmandu. Many ecosystems are formed in the upper streams of the river. The river was also the main source of irrigation of upper agricultural lands and the daily needs of the people. There are many Hindus and Buddhist temples along the river and the ghats steps for different rituals for the people. The design language of these ghats consists of steps with larger prints, niche, balconies, platforms in different size, shape and materials. Circular, rectangular, square platforms divide the steps into landings. These similar elements in different layers and levels with the edges of parties, small temples, creates a pattern of a visual character. These platforms, landings, and the temples, parties with open pavilions on the edges create spaces for different activities. The culture of Nepal encompasses the various cultures belonging to the 125 distinct ethnic groups present in Nepal. It is expressed through music and dance, art and craft, folklore, languages and literature, philosophy and religion, festivals and celebrations, food and drinks. Most of these cultures of Nepal are directly and indirectly celebrated in open spaces or community spaces in different forms. Example, Dasai or Vijaya Dasami is one of the most significant and auspicious festivals of Nepal, celebrated predominantly by the Hindu, in which all ethnicities participate. It's a 15-day celebration starting from Ghatasthapana to Fulpati. During this period, all the people gather in open spaces, chow in villages and parks in town, sing bhajans, dance, play a swing called rotaping, etc. These spaces are in the nodes of villages and towns which open up to the vistas and views. Chhat. The rituals of Chhat are observed over 4 days. They include holy wedding, fasting, abstaining from drinking water called brata, standing in water, and offering prasad and arga for sun rising and setting sun. Some devotees also perform a prostration march as they head to the river banks. Devotees gather along the spaces of river, ponds, and other water bodies for the rituals. Riverside spaces are carved out traditionally, which doesn't disturb the riparian ages of the rivers and its ecology and allows those rituals. Dance and music. Different dances are performed by different ethnic groups of Nepal. The open spaces are shaped accordingly in proximity to community buildings for these activities. If we analyze the landscape character of these areas, the central circular field are ideal for those kind of musics and dance. Gentle slopes for the proper viewing angles form a visual character of the spaces with the community buildings on the edges and sitting spaces with trees backdrop. I cannot miss the Lumbini as a cultural landscape in Nepal. In 1970, the International Committee for Development of Lumbini initiated the preparation of master plan which was conceptualized by Kenjo Tange. The Kenjo Tange master plan was finalized and approved in 1978, which was a 3-mile area plan. It is based on geometric shapes and the notion of the path to enlightenment. The entrance is placed in the north in the new Lumbini village, from where the visitor enters the site to begin the journey from a location of worldly activities. Then the visitor proceeds to the monastic zone for knowledge and spiritual purification before reaching to the sacred garden for enlightenment. Landscapes here inspires us how the serene natural setting of those sacred gardens, ancient shrines, and the religious building blend together with the landscapes created. Above all mentioned ecological spaces, socio-cultural spaces have a certain hierarchy from residence level to larger level in rural and urban context. The hierarchy of open spaces in rural context starts with the PD, the semi-open spaces in the steps of each individual houses, which are used for different activities like festivals, gatherings, and drying foods, etc. Angan. Angan spaces in front of individual houses which act as shared spaces with close communities are used on different community gatherings and socio-cultural activities. Chautari in community level act as a shaded resting space while traveling and natural view deck. Urban context. Hierarchy of urban context starts with courtyards at residential level, semi-open spaces shared by immediate neighbors, to the streets as a shared spaces at community level. The chowks, open spaces with shading trees or building structured at a node of one or more streets, are the community level spaces. The Darbar squares have larger opening spaces shared as a celebration spaces for different festivals and jatras. City level parks as a green sink in urban areas act as a larger open spaces for the people in town. As I explained earlier, the nature of Nepalese landscapes, the patterns in them, and the culture of the people living here gives inspirations and become the base of the design. My design process is not a structured one, but a practical one where I get ideas from the surrounding nature, Nepalese landscapes, culture, people, on site demonstrations, and the local material. The meandering pathways of the hills of Nepal always triggers the journey with different vistas and the sense of mystery, which hints at the landscape design of this residence. The carved pathway along the green islands with small trees leading to the entry of the residence hides and reveals the view of the house as a person approaches nearer and nearer. Trees on the west buffer the residence from noise and submersion. The open lawn with a sitting space under a tree gathers the family members, creating a sense of togetherness. The courtyard space is the gathering space for the festivals like Dasai and Tihar, etc. Like the courtyard space in the ancient Nevari homes, which will be the connecting spaces in festivals. The boulders resembling the Nepalese riverine landscapes were collected from the site itself while foundation excavation, which triggered every one of us about the site history which once was a floodplain. The textures and the patterns evolve with the practical demonstration on site with local mentions and materials. These generates the ideas for different patterns, textures, their stability, local materials and the workmanship. All this provides a clear picture of installation. And the public project gate design on Sunauli Beleya border in Vairava. The existing gate was in dilapidated condition and was a crowded space with hustle and bustle of people and the goods loaded with trucks in queue in custom. There was no separate pedestrian pathways and pause points for the people rushing to and fro with the luggages. So, starting with the questions in mind, like what imagery comes to mind while we and the people entering from the border think of Nepal, and the pride that we feel. We went on searching for answers. Yes, the Himalayas, the place where the heaven meets earth, its grandeur, Nepalese temple architecture, the interplay of mass and void of the temple, pedestrian reclaim with introduction of shaded seating spaces and a separate pedestrian pathways. These formed the overall design of the gate and its surrounding landscapes, and a right-of-way with separate entry points for the loaded heavy trucks, vehicles, and the pedestrians. The pedestrian entry is extended with seating spaces and a pausing space with their luggage while traveling. I was involved in another public project, street elevation in Pari Butol. Pari Butol, being the origin of Butol city, had its own street characters. Started with the questions, what made those streets lively and happening in those times? Finding answers, growing through the history, photographs, similar examples of the country. Again, those were the culture, the people, and the shared spaces by them, street character, and the elevations. The community spaces that diminished textures, materials, etc. So, creating different notes for those gatherings, chautaris for shaded seatings, parties for resting house, common celebration chaur, and reclaiming the character with materials, shared spaces, and the facades which revives the old town. The riverfront design competition was held by Society of Nepalese Architects, which was located on Teku along the Vishnumati riverside. As explained on the rivers system of Nepal, Vishnumati river is also one of the major river which meets Bagmati river. Vishnumati river holds history of cultural, social, and agricultural activities being performed. Chaotic expansion of houses, and ignorance of people has made the area suffer and are now out of green areas which once was prominent. Bisnumati River, being the monsoon-fed river, tends to expand in monsoon season on heavy rainfalls. Keeping this in mind, the programs on the waterfront are designed in 3 different levels. Different community level programs are located in the upper level and the river ghats are located in the lower levels with cultural programs. The lower ghats are shaped following the cultural patterns that take place on the edges of the river. The design of edges, steps with plinth, landings, create a space for different cultural activities and also provides an uninterrupted view of river at upper level. And the Nepalese river and landscapes with the layers of boulders and vegetation is a must go for riparian edges of the riverfront design. Thank you.
To talk about Nepalese landscape architecture. So my presentation today is going to focus on the components of Kathmandu Valley. I belong from Kathmandu, so it is very close to my heart how these components that I've been seeing since childhood were actually an essence of what Nepalese landscape architecture was. So we all know Nepal is known for its mountains, the way of life, individuals, and its rich history. Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, and Patan are main cities in Kathmandu Valley. The ancient temples and palace architecture of the valley are well known and quite impressive. These ancient temple complexes, housing systems, and city planning teach valuable lessons about landscape architecture. A similar landscape language of rural areas, the ideology of Kathmandu Valley also revolves around ecological and socio-cultural design. Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, and Patan Darbar Square, all traditional Nepalese architectural masterpieces, are also listed as World Heritage Sites. These were once Malla palaces. They are the result of centuries of optimization of material use, construction techniques, and climate considerations. The Malla rule, which lasted from the 10th century to 18th century, is the source of most notable architectural style. Looking at the architecture of Kathmandu Darbar Square, which is also called Hanuman Dhoka Darbar Square, is designed with intricate networking of courtyards. Technique for creating an open space with tightly woven mesh while simultaneously providing structural stability, these palace courtyards were used as formal courts, places of worship, and even as royal baths. According to a research by Pant and Funud published in 2004, the structure of the fabric of the town is also arranged by a series of huge and small courtyards, also called as nani or chok. The courtyards have social and cultural significance in addition to serving ecological function by providing adequate lighting and ventilation. These shared spaces where the majority of local Newars live serve as a social hub. Common sites include a chiba, which is a miniature stupa, people performing household chores, a place to gather, and even a place for children to play. These open spaces, stone paving also adds to the intricate underground water channels that control surface runoff. Walking the narrow streets and alleys of Kathmandu and the towns that surround it can appear quite chaotic and sometimes inconvenient for outsiders. The courtyards and squares connected by these narrow streets slowly but surely demonstrate, when looked at closely, that there is a logic in this connection. Since automobiles hadn't been invented then, the streets were built for just pedestrians. There's a raised platform known as falcha where locals interact, they sit and then they talk with their neighbors, and also travelers can rest before continuing their journey. The streets were made of brick and mortar and have stone edge with different patterns of brick paving. Additionally, there is a distinct drainage on both sides. These drainage carry the surface runoff, which is then collected in puku or pokhari, which are man-made ponds, for example, Rani Pokhari. These
drainage systems without affecting the street landscape were quite functional and aesthetically pleasing as well. Rani Pokhari is a stunning ecological and architectural masterpiece that exemplifies the Malla era's meticulous craftsmanship. The pond was an engineering feat in addition to its beauty. To keep it full all year, a complex underground system of channels supplied it with water. It also managed the surrounding surface water during the monsoon, allowing runoff from far market to enter the pond and slowly past farmland to rivulets. At that time, the region's water management system was shaped by numerous Rani Pokhari in various parts of Kathmandu Valley. Because Rani Pokhari replenished groundwater, it maintained the flow of nearby water sources like hittis and wells even during the dry season. A hitti, also known as Dhungedhara, is a Nepalese traditional stone spout with steps sunken structure. It is a stone waterway with intricate carvings that allows water to flow uninterrupted from underground water sources. Stone spouts are common sights in Kathmandu Valley. Many Nepalese still rely on the traditional hittis for daily water supply. Since 500 years ago, these have been a prominent landscape feature that reflect water features and also mark as fundamental water supply system. Rani Pokhari is connected to the open field Tudikhel by a linear plan. Tudikhel may be as old as the city itself, where indigenous traditions, festivals, legends, and superstitions are deeply ingrained in its culture. The term Tudikhel refers to open green plain land in Nepali. In the compact settlement of Kathmandu core city, this multifunctional open space has a great importance for public socially, culturally, and environmentally. Since ancient times, various communities have used this space for celebrations of festivals and activities, as well as for public assemblies and processions such as Ghode Jatra, Losar, and even Mahashivratri. Apart from socio-cultural importance, this large public space also fulfills ecological purposes for groundwater recharge. Even during natural disasters, this area has been used as refuge area. The image shows the setting during 2015 earthquake. With the passage of time, a number of transformations occurred in Tudikhel, such as decrease in size, change in activity, and also in land use. The open space of actual Tudikhel has decreased over time to make it more diminished in size at present. Just like Tudikhel, Kathmandu's unique organic planning is an interwoven mesh of thoughtfully placed open spaces, such as Chaur, which is an open field such as Narayan Chaur and Sano Gaucharin; Chautari, a platform with large tree used as a gathering space or rest stops; Party is a meeting place for social and religious gatherings and also a rest stop for travelers. Another important element is Dabali or public squares, a multifunctional market space for mass gathering, cultural processions such as Indra Jatra, and also leisure activities. The square is generally connected by numerous streets and contain a place of worship. The largest religious street festival in Kathmandu, which is Indra Jatra, is also deeply rooted to the traditional streets of the city. Mass dances of deities and demons, displays of chariots, and rituals in honor of god Indra all contribute to these festivities. The narrow streets and squares are connected in such a way that these chariots are pulled to different squares where devotees can visit. These squares still hold great significance in our community. During Malla rule, architecture and ecology were focused together to create indigenous social spaces. The rich architectural history during the Malla rule is still exemplary, and no other Nepali architectural style is able to replace or come to par. After the end of this historic era in 18th century, the Shahas ruled Nepal. During this period, new style of architecture was introduced to the country by Rana Prime Minister Janga Bahadur Rana, who was keen on modernizing the country after he was inspired by what he saw in European countries during his visit in 1850. This initiated development in Nepal in the field of science, technology, engineering, and water resources. Cousins of then Prime Minister Chandra Samsher Rana, Kishore and Kumar Narsingh Rana were the first Nepali to receive foreign engineering degree. They mastered neoclassical architectural design. Chandra Samsir's palace, Singha Darbar, was one of the first ever palace that adorned all neoclassical features, from column orders to pediments to even formal garden styles. Another notable build was Khandagar, a clock tower in 1920s. During Rana regime, many Western-style palaces were designed and built, along with neoclassical style formal gardens. Inspired by French gardens, Keshar Mahal or Garden of Dreams is one of its examples. Exposure and Western influences had shaped the way architecture was perceived in main cities of the country. Many large-scale institutions, government buildings, public spaces were developed. Some examples are Godavari Botanical Garden and the Central Zoo that were established in 1960s. These type of projects, they brought a more ecological aspect in the more macro level of the city. Some prominent projects designed by foreign architects have also been valuable for contemporary Nepalese architecture. For example, Narayan Hiti Palace by Benjamin Polk in 1963, Taragaon Museum by Karl Prussia in 1974, involvement of Austrian architects for Bhaktapur Development Project. Many experiments and renditions of modern architecture were reflected in urban areas of the country with a number of growing architects. As the nation developed, architecture developed gradually, but awareness of landscape architecture remains a challenge. The importance and ideology imparted during Muller rule hasn't been implemented in present context. Most landscape designs have been done by architects and some were successful in adding significant positive impact. Mr. Bharath, who graduated from Harvard in 1979 with landscape architecture degree, was Nepal's first landscape architect. As a government official, he has been involved in numerous ecological restoration projects. These include, among others, landscape design for IOE campus and regional planning for Devghat area. Mr. Bharath is also an academician and has been teaching in various reputed architectural colleges. He states that majority of current design efforts are primarily cosmetic, with little regard to the environment. He strongly believes that we should apply what we can learn from the past. Our guiding principle ought to be aesthetically pleasing and socially as well as culturally appropriate. Holistic development. As a designer, I try to incorporate some of the traditional and vernacular ideologies in my work. For example, using stone spouts as a decorative element for pool's feature wall. One of my main objectives is to create spaces that will have a meaning to the user, an experiential space within that corner. Even if it's walking on footpath, use of various plant textures, materials, play with color to enhance these spaces. Functional spaces take center stage, nevertheless, aesthetics are equally important. Use of benches along a long pathway for elderly to rest or act as a meeting spot. This concept brings out the use of functionality as well as aesthetics in any space that we use. I try to draw inspiration from vernacular style, stay connected to the architectural roots of the city. One successful method for connecting roots of the city has been material selection with brick and stone combination. Vernacular design approach to landscape can and will revive the beauty of socio-cultural background of traditional settlements. Kathmandu Valley has very rich interconnectivity between existing landscape elements, but these are not maintained to its glory. Open spaces such as Tudi Khel, Rani Pokhari, Darbar Squares, Bagmati Riverine Edge, Ghats, the streetscapes are all assets of Nepalese landscape architecture. River corridors, if designed with ecological sensitivity, will become the glory of Kathmandu. And also at the moment, the parts of the riverine edge have been revitalized, such as the Bagmati Action Plan, and also some cleaning campaigns have been done at the moment, the parts of riverine edges have been revitalized, such as implementing Bagmati Action Plan 2009-2014, and also by initiating cleaning campaigns. Concepts such as placemaking will in some way help raise awareness of the pressing need to transform Kathmandu's dreary areas into vibrant ones. We as designers should aim towards enhancing the public realm to cultivate an authentic sense of place, create beauty, and to impart civic pride, connect neighborhoods, support community health and safety, also to catalyze economic development and encourage environment sustainability.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed in both the presentations is that the man-made is left very tight in the tradition that the houses are built nearby, streets are small, and things are relatively hard. And it's on the peripheries and on the outside that nature takes its full um, dimension. And it occurred to me that perhaps here, in this kind of environment, it might be interesting to think of landscape design as concerned with time, the seasons, the festivals, the human activities, which rejuvenate things, less thinking in terms of space, less thinking in terms of defining spatial entities, and more thinking in terms of weaving together human activities into the landscape. At the riverfront, for example. And in every case, it seems to me that in Nepal, given the seasons, given the change in the temperatures and so on and so forth, it would be very interesting to consider landscape as a cycle. And that is something where I think Nepal could make a very significant contribution to the thinking about landscape design as connected to time rather than space. Normally, landscape is thought to soften a very horrid man-made environment and is supposed to make it more livable, etc., etc. But the Nepalis seem to have a very different attitude towards it. Make the city the place of human interactions and make it as easy to use as possible for human interactions, and make another set of festivals which take you out to connect with the flowers that are coming out, the river that has more water in it at a certain season, etc., etc. And I think this double nature of landscape design, one, the landscape of walls, floors, plinths, what we call otlas, etc., and the other, the landscape of the rock and the soil and the grass and the plant and the tree. And I think this is a very wonderful way of considering landscape as something to do with one, historically constant human occupation, and the other, a cycle of seasons.
Which is very significant in terms of a lesson, that I would take from that kind of region, that there is a different approach to treating the land, and treating the land when it comes to residential or a kind of settlement, and treating the land when it comes to abundance in terms of, areas around the river or temple complexes, which are set in the grooves. So I think there is a tremendous sense which is different from other places that you normally come across and see. So to my view, I think Nepal, the region, the mountains, the valleys, they have a very different character. So that's it. And I think these have to be somehow become the basis for somehow reintroducing these ideas. Leave the greens, where they really belong, and treat the hard surfaces as your landscape, bring water. So this is what roughly I feel about this particular region.
In our own country, still we struggle as architects to be known as architects and differentiate from engineers. And so landscape architect is such a specialized field where they actually need to work with all these other professionals, landscape architects with just architects, with other kind of infrastructure engineers, that that kind of building an identity is going to be, it will take time, I think, because a lot of architects tend to think that they can take on landscape architecture because it's just textures and plants and hard and soft landscapes, or that's the third thing. The fourth thing I want to bring in, sorry, I'm just raising all the points here because I think as we go into presentations, these things will further be enhanced and talked about, is really looking at architecture schools where these kind of, how can it be introduced in the curriculum? I look at it in two ways. One is really having courses on landscape architecture as mandatory courses, not just elective. And number two, how this kind of goes with teaching architecture itself. Because when you look at design, architectural design projects in studios where you have larger lands to deal with, the whole site planning, establishing a context, all of that is so much related to landscape. So how do we go about that? And I think there will be common issues in all these countries. So I thought I'd just raise them here. And I see those coming out of Nepal because some of those missing elements from the presentation, wonderful presentations, which actually got us thinking to be able to point out what's missing, and maybe it'll be discussed more as we go along other presentations. Thank you.
One of the things that you could notice in the presentation is, the temporal dimension of the use of either the compact settlement or the outside. In the first presentation, you could see certain, invisible spaces were suddenly coming to visibility once in a year, like Chhat Puja. Suddenly, making people realize there are, areas which are very important to us, and also the socio-cultural aspect and the ecological aspect. For example, the water archaeology that the later presenter presented in case of Rani Pokhari. So here you could see the way landscape has been approached by in the past is something that kind of like brings society, culture, ecology all together. And how do we go about it in a situation that prevails in Kathmandu, as noticed by the later commentator, is and also can be seen in the presentation. There are we have to kind of follow opportunistic model, in the sense that there are certain spaces that are left out that kind of reminds of us history and culture that we had, and how can we continue it. So landscape architecture in this particular sense needs to be looked at from this how do we continue it so that sense of history, identity can be preserved. So our landscape architects probably needs to kind of look into this situatedness of history, culture, environment, and that kind of knowledge needs to be integrated in the academia when we kind of train our young architects also. So
what these two Nepalese examples have shown us is the place from which we can learn on how to live with nature is in these relatively peripheral, far-flung, like our northern areas, the Himalayan areas, these which have been more remote from the main pathways of modernism, will survive, if any. And after we're all gone and wiped out by this destructive globalization, I think it's these communities that will survive and hopefully provide the seeds for us to start being civilized once again.
The whole aspect of looking at this vast nature, and especially the way the Nepal presentation started, and Kamal mentioned the northern areas of Pakistan, the mountains. So it kind of reverberates one's spirit, whether the mountains or you look at in certain coastal areas or other areas, the rivers that one was talking about. So rather than looking at these as just spaces, the whole backdrop of nature is so strong that it reverberates your spirit to be inspired to then, when landscape architects design within urban environment, rural, where they're looking at hard stuff of concrete or whatever, the built part, how does that juxtapose with that spirit that has been invigorated by nature? I think that's one element which probably is there, but not really spoken about. And I think we should discuss that. At the same time, the other aspect that I think we really need to look at is that as part of landscape design, how are we looking at mitigating disasters? Because whenever you look at nature, whether it's mountains or riverbanks, or now you talk about rain, how are we looking at designing landscape to be able to mitigate those kind of disasters? I know you can't avoid disasters, but there is a strong element which can be introduced as part of the design by landscape architects to be able to, enrich and really make a mark while designing, and be able to look at a lot of managing a lot of crises situations that arise because of these disasters.
I was actually thinking when the previous person spoke, whether landscape thinking needs to be introduced much earlier, like in maybe secondary, higher education. Just like we had community living and we have history, I think just the landscape thinking is something which needs to be a precursor to doing any design course or any course where you're going to impact the environment.
This is one of two presentations about landscape design in Pakistan. The first, this presentation, is about landscaping in Lahore. It calls for a need to closely monitor public use of Lahore's historical landscapes. It also calls attention to a demand for more well-distributed public open space in the city and the need to focus on lasting, sustainable outdoor spaces rather than on transient beautification. Pakistan's range of tropical to temperate climate zones enables an enjoyment of all four seasons in a variety of landscapes, from the rugged northern highlands dotted with forts and settlements to the arid tableland of the Baluchistan plateau in the west, and from the foothills of the Himalayas through the plains of central and southern Punjab down to the coastlands of Sindh. Landscape, as cultural expression, embodies both Pakistan's historic garden traditions as well as the country's cultural landscapes that describe community engagement over centuries with the region's natural and cultural heritage. Both forms of cultural expression need safeguarding, but formal designed landscapes are particularly vulnerable to population and urbanization pressures, especially urban infrastructural development, as manifested at the historical garden sites of Lahore. Cultural landscapes ideally managed by local community groups are better protected. Both kinds of landscapes lie along historic passages of movement across land, but the rivers and waterways that were transportation arteries once were also sites of natural and cultural significance. The River Ravi, once a transportation channel and a recreational amenity providing sites for many Mughal gardens of Lahore, was gradually lost to public consciousness, suffering first from the decline in flows that drastically affected its ecosystem functions, and more recently from the construction of the city's ring road, which condemned this lifeline of the city to its periphery to be a permanent dumping point for the city's sewage. A number of livestock farms and informal settlements that sprung up in the last few decades along the River Ravi now form the river landscape at Lahore, and the vegetation that once lined the river banks has disappeared. The Ravi River National Park, a proposal funded by the Asian Development Bank, was conceived in context of a recent debate to claim the riverfront for real estate tycoons or to develop it as a public open space. It was with the latter objective in mind that I was commissioned to prepare a landscape proposal at the Ravi River site, a project on which architect Alia Ashraf of Lahore and I worked jointly. The Ravi Park was conceived as a location for constructed wetlands that would filter the discharge of nalas, enhance biodiversity, and serve as an educational resource. It was also intended to be a venue for diverse public gatherings and sports, an opportunity for revegetation of the river banks, a nature sanctuary, and a means of integrating the surrounding cultural landscapes. Together with the Ravi site, other sites in the river basin, notably those with nalas, were proposed as potential public open spaces. The site at the confluence of the Hadiara drain and the river Ravi is one such example. Lahore, Pakistan's cultural capital, combines the old and the new. The alleys of the walled city are still animated with old bazaars and punctuated with squares and grand old mosques, the Badshahi and the Wazir Khan mosque courtyards remaining the spectacular landscapes that they once were. The gardens of the Lahore fort have come under the protection of the Lahore Walled City Authority, and this development is responsible for the WCLA's attempts to conserve some of the old Pai Bagh within the fort, as well as the Huzuri Bagh, a Sikh period garden located outside the fort, which is planted and maintained in the British style of landscape garden, common at all Lahore's garden sites, regardless of their functions, I should add. Lahore's Mall and the Lawrence Gardens along the Mall are British legacies. The Mall is still graced with majestic peepal trees, and the planting in Lawrence Gardens along the walks, the mounds, and the grassed plots is also remarkably well preserved. Recent additions of structures and seating in the gardens are somewhat unfortunate, however. Flower shows and other events continue to be a feature at the Lawrence Gardens, as they were during the British rule, and also figure at other public parks such as the Racecourse Park, but the decision to install recreational equipment in the main area of the Racecourse Park to generate revenue needs to be reconsidered. Lahore's irrigation canal, once lined with rows of bordering willows and poplars, has unfortunately lost its serenity after the construction of 12 underpasses, enabling it to become a 23-kilometer signal-free vehicular way. That said, credit must be given to the Parks and Horticultural Authority, PHA, for replanting the canal with trees that were destroyed in the construction works. The PHA must also be applauded for the seasonal arrangements of planting along the canal road, as well as exit points of vehicular accessways such as Lahore's motorway and ring road, which, like the canal road verges, are also beautified in a garden style of landscaping with clipped shrubs, beds of annuals, and mown grass, all requiring intensive maintenance. In the garden suburbs of New Lahore, meanwhile, a private developer has embellished the canal with models of architectural landmarks and flora and fauna to delight the public. Roundabouts are other popular sites of the PHA for landscape beautification. An example is the so-called Liberty Market roundabout at the Goldberg Main Boulevard, which was designed as a Mughal garden pavilion with chini khanas inspired by those at the Shalimar. The pavilion's charm is much abated now in the deluge of waterworks, lights, and flowering annuals. Given the inequity of public open space in Lahore, the misappropriation of historic gardens is inevitable, and therefore public use at historic sites needs to be carefully monitored. Lahore's Shalimar Bagh is a case in point where use and misuse are not limited to youth only, but buffaloes equally seem to have been permitted to graze in the gardens freely during the recent COVID epidemic. At Nadra Begum's tomb in the Miamir locality, the hall's water reservoir has been turned into a cricket field, and the causeway seems to lead right into the informal housing along a wall of the tomb site. The example of Hiran Minar in Chikhopura outside of Lahore indicates how the tomb causeway may have once appeared. For all its charms, the city centre of Lahore suffers from unchecked and unregulated new development and a disregard for the values that nurtured the city I grew up in. In general, urbanization and development have endangered Lahore's natural and cultural heritage, created problems of public open space provision and equity, threatened land and water ecosystems, and demonstrate the urgent need for environmental remediation with green infrastructure, to list just a few issues. I conclude with an image of the smog that engulfs the city today, as it does every winter, restricting public use of the outdoors in this city of gardens. Such irony. Thank you, and I request you to please wait for Ms. Komal Parvez's presentation.
Hello, I'm Komal Parvez. I'm a landscape architect working in Karachi. I'm going to talk about the landscape timeline of Karachi. Now, Karachi is located in the south of Pakistan near the Arabian Sea. And the city started as a fishing village and it grew to a metropolis of 20 million people. So Karachi, the fishing village, was the early 18th century, and the village tribe was known as Kolachi, and it was run by a lady called Mai Kolachi, and that's how Karachi derived its name. In 1795, the Talpurs seized Karachi from the Khan of Kalat, and the Talpurs were patrons of art and architecture, and they made the Menorah fort and traded with Oman and Bahrain. The very prosperous Sayyid Pujumal came to Karachi after a family dispute, and he describes Karachi as an unattractive place, a rocky desert which was fit for only grazing animals. So the town continued to grow, and there were two prominent gates called the Kharadar, which means the salt gate, which faced the sea, and Meethadar, which faced the Liari River. The British occupied Karachi in 1839. The Menorah fort was reinforced and the mangrove and caper bushes were cut down. The labor was paid by dates from Bahrain and Oman. Now, the British built a town away from the natives, and it was in a grid-like manner with large residences. The commercial area and the housing were oriented north-south, and the law courts and the St. Patrick's Cathedral were oriented east-west to form a cross. In 1869, Karachi became the largest exporter of wheat and cotton in India, as it was the first port of call for trade coming via the Suez Canal. It also gained importance as a strategic military town for the British intervention to Central Asia during the First World War. So the town's prosperity was reflected in its art and architecture and landscape. Karachi was part of the Bombay Presidency. Sir Lloyd was the governor of Bombay, and his wife, Lady Lloyd, visited Karachi. The lady fancied walking to the sea. Prominent businessmen, Mr. Katrak and Mr. Kotari, stepped forward and financed the promenade to the sea, and the Lady Lloyd Pier, the bandstand, and the pavilion. Now, these features in the landscape represented Karachi as the city by the sea. Karachi's businessmen also made many other institutions. They constructed colleges, schools, and hospitals. Now, one of the most famous colleges in Karachi is the DJ Science College, which was funded by Dayaram. And we can see the date trees and the tamarind trees in the old photograph. But in the new photograph, there's an absence of trees, and we can just see ornamental fountains in the picture. So another important and iconic building of Karachi is the Empress Market. The Empress Market had a brutal history. The sepoys in the British government rebelled, and they were executed by cannons on this very spot. So the then Commissioner, Frere, thought that they would prevent the natives from constructing any monument in their memory, and they instead constructed the Empress Market. The Empress Market was constructed to commemorate Queen Victoria, and Jodhpur stone was brought in from India. Here's another British landmark, which is Frere Hall. It was constructed in honor of Sir Frere, who held the post of Commissioner Karachi for 8 long years, and then he became the governor of Bombay. Now, the plan of the Frere Hall Gardens consists of actually 3 gardens. One of the gardens is in the shape of a cross with Queen Victoria's statue in the center. Then the other garden was made by Mr. Dinshaw, and the third had a bandstand. In this slide, Frere Hall is viewed in the larger context with the exclusive neighbor Sinthlab and residences of the British government. Frere Hall was considered a place for housing landmarks. World War I memorial was also constructed on one of its gardens. The landscape elements at Frere Hall, the bandstand, statue, the bird bath, the fountain, and the cast iron lamps set the standard for design of future parks in Karachi. We can see an influence of these elements in parks and public spaces that are even built today. Another important place of this era is the botanical and the zoological gardens. In 1799, the British East India Company established a factory on the outskirts of Karachi, but they were expelled due to their dubious activities, and the factory gardens became known as Sarkari Bagh or government gardens. When the British reoccupied Karachi, converted the 43-acre garden to be used for cultivation of fruits and vegetables for their army and fodder for the government cattle.
Before 1947, Karachi had a population of 400,000. After independence, 600,000 people migrated to the city. This created an acute housing shortage. Therefore, many new housing communities were developed. The new communities had numerous parks ranging from small neighborhood parks to community parks with areas larger than 50 acres.
The city has other significant landscape areas such as golf courses and the Kurangi estuary and the Malir farms, which supply food to the city. A 130-acre park, the largest in Karachi, which is called the Bin Qasim Park, has been constructed around the Kothari Promenade. Now, these parks, which were built after partition, and especially during the 1990s to 2000s, depict a cookie cutter design, having identical boundary walls and pavilions, wannabe British bandstands, stone benches and cast iron poles, symmetrical layouts which really depict a mismatch of British and Mughal elements. Among landscape practices, Mr. A.K. Khan stands out as a pioneer. He studied at the Allahabad Agriculture Institute and after partition joined the PWD as a horticulturist. In the early 50s, he received training in UK in landscape design and planning. He established the Horticulture Society of Pakistan and wrote 6 books on horticulture and landscape. Government projects. His designs of parks depict innovation and planting which bears a relevance to the context of the place. The landscape of Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Mazar was constructed in the Grand Mughal design by architect Zegam Jafri in the 80s. And also in the 80s and after the 80s, roundabouts started being developed with monuments by architects and artists, creating landmarks for political personalities. Parks that were developed in the 60s and 70s were encroached upon illegally or were allowed commercial activities for 2 decades after the 90s. And this was certainly the darkest period for public spaces. A severe heat wave followed by flooding created a reaction and a realization among civil society and the government. The Supreme Court of Pakistan decreed that all commercial activity and encroachments on public spaces, including billboards on streets, should be removed. And this resulted in tree plantation by the municipality and the citizens. The emergence of the largest private housing developer in Pakistan, Bahria, and its impact on landscape design cannot be ignored. It provides a well-developed infrastructure, streetscape. However, the inclusion of recognizable international landmarks like Eiffel Tower, Statue of Liberty, Italian sculptures, and Dubai-style dancing fountains and large grassy areas has created a model of unsustainability and dubious aesthetics. It, however, continues to thrive. At the other end of the spectrum is the campaign by the previous government to plant 1 billion trees to mitigate climate change. Activists from within the civil society are also advocating urban forestry and saving natural resources like mangroves. As a landscape architect practicing in Karachi, I cannot remain far behind. I started an organization called Chao and have been trying to create awareness among school children and the general public and government agencies about climate change. This group consists of friends, family, and colleagues, and we are trying to improve public spaces and institutions by planting trees and assisting in landscape design. Starting the first private landscape architecture practice has not been easy. I'm grateful for the support from senior architects and colleagues. My work ranges from private, corporate, public, and international projects. International landscape architects have contributed to prestigious projects in Karachi, such as the Aga Khan Hospital and University. Now, how do we move forward? We need a school of landscape architecture because we don't have the numbers. We don't have landscape architects in great numbers in the country. And once we have great numbers, then we can opt for legislation so that our profession is recognized by the government and by the private sector. Thank you. I hope this gives a sense of what landscape architecture is in Karachi and in Pakistan.
I've noticed, at least in the last 40 years that I've been working on this, or 37 years, is that the political narrative or the developmental narrative has gradually changed in the country. So 20 years back or 25 years back, was it important for a politician or a local leader or a local bureaucrat to talk about environment or landscape and so on and so forth? It wasn't. But now, I think there's an increasing conversation for just about every situation, whether it is a new road being laid or whether it's a new airport or it's a public park or a new housing colony or a museum, or it's a conservation landscape, that landscape architects are being called to the fore. They've been called. What happens? What is the kind of work they do later? I think is a very different question. But my conjecture is that after talking about basic necessities of, quote unquote, roti, kapda, makan, the voting polity is looking for development of a certain kind within the places that they're living in. And in that, of course, they're talking about clean water, clean roads, but then they're saying beyond that what? And I find a big push that has happened to the cause of landscape in the country in the last about 10, 12 years. Again, I mean, with a rider, that doesn't necessarily mean that, the work is very good.
Okay. The thing is that when I was doing this research, I found it somewhat of a very strong element in landscape design was that the political involvement in public spaces. And it started earlier on. As far as Karachi is concerned, every public place has been made by some sort of political motivation. And that got me thinking that landscape architecture, now the good side, that got me thinking how powerful a public space is, because a political entity has to appear to be a good politician by supporting a public space. He has to have his name written there, that he was the one who created that space. And that tradition, starting from the British, is continuing. Every time there's a political change in the country, somebody wants to do some good in their own way in a political space, and they want to do it, in a public space, and they want to do it very quickly. Now, we don't have landscape architects, so they reach to the anybody who is in the municipality or anybody who would give them the designs and the direction very, very quickly. With the result that these spaces are like a hodgepodge of design, because you really don't have designers. You just have people who think that this would, look good and would be created in the right amount of time so that that political entity can make its mark on the city.
So I am increasingly sort of getting interested in how politics and landscape is so intermingled, especially in my city.
Right. So I think what he was trying to say is that, or what little I gathered from what he was really trying to say is that both, I mean, Komal says it, and also Professor said it, that they're not really, they're seeing a quick cut solution to things, egos that need to be fulfilled. And I think that pretty much was and is the case even in India. I mean, that's the bulk of the situation. But even then, one is beginning to see every now and then a little bit that is slightly sensible at an institutional level or at a political level. And you might even begin to say that they are the first sort of signs of sanity that you want to cling on to, that you want to hold.
First of all, I think you are equating the landscape architect with care for the landscape. And it's not necessarily always that. But what struck me in both these presentations was the contrast between earthly life, which the British, of course, in Karachi, it was the enjoyment of that edible landscape in a way. And in Lahore, it was the courtly life. But in Lahore, the interesting thing was that the earthly life was limited, was finite. And the garden was what brought infinity into that life. And I think the landscape's role as something which also I was highly impressed by those trees in the Lahore.
Lawrence Canal.
Yes.
Lawrence Canal. Yeah.
Yes. And we think of landscape as something which will last a month, 2 months, 3 months. But really speaking, that's the one that persisted. If we think about Lahore, we have to think about that. And I think every ruler, every political system ultimately recognizes that what you will leave as a stamp is actually what you did to the land. And in that sense, landscape architects and geologists, horticulturalists, all of these people, and especially activists like Komal, have a great role to play in making sure that that voice is heard. And I think this is something that it seems that in Pakistan, they seem to be doing it really well.
Back to one of the observations that you made, that things are changing because, activists are coming to the forefront and the government is listening, because somehow the government is so unpopular in some of the aspects that it wants to listen to these, softer aspects to improve its sort of impression to the public. Do you understand? Right. It's using landscape to show that it cares for the people, and the people know, what the government is doing. And I'm referring to the government around my city because, we have like provinces, and each province is now independently working after a certain constitutional, amendment. So there's the federal government, which is in Islamabad, and then there are these 4 provinces. So what you see in Lahore is not necessarily what's happening in Karachi. And Karachi is the main city which provides all the economic, prosperity to the country, because it's a very robust, port city. But the rest of the areas of Sindh, let's say that we are located in Sindh, right? So the rest of the areas in Sindh are very, very different because they're more rural and they're much smaller cities. So Karachi is the largest city of Sindh. Now, I'm not showing a rosy picture, but I thought I was showing a bad picture because you see the things are, the public areas and the public parks don't work the way they should. they're not being developed. Most of them just go barren. So what happens is that when there's a political change, suddenly there's a flurry of activity and people want to patch up all the, public spaces. And then the design gets compromised because they want to do it very quickly with some person who doesn't know anything about landscape design.
I think I've tried to enlarge on the kinds of issues that we should be looking at, that we should be addressing in landscape architecture. Landscape architects should be more concerned with these issues than they are at this time. I think they are just engaged in too many frivolities like beautifying, and that is what the government wants. All the political leaders just want that. They just want adornment and beautification, and landscape architecture has just become that. And I'm sorry to say that it's been like this. I don't see much of a change in Lahore. Maybe in Karachi there is more of a sense of protest about public space and making them usable for everybody. But there's no such, I don't see any such signs in Lahore. I just see a lot of money being foolishly spent in making flower beds and doing things that are that just require too much maintenance. And I mean, things like city exit points, they should have robust planting. They should not have little flower beds and pruned shrubs everywhere. And there should be some consideration for the kinds of land, for the differentiation between the different landscapes we have. We have historical landscapes, we have public landscapes, we have parks, but they are all treated in the same way and I think that that defeats the purpose of landscape architecture completely.
For example, in Nepal, in Kathmandu itself, I could see several of landscape parks being designed, and they are largely being privatized in the name of management of public spaces. There are tariffs being put, and I believe the kind of landscape history we had and the public space design history we have, people are these are not becoming very inclusive, and also due to the security reasons, public activities are put under surveillance. They are in a way controlled. So I was wondering, whether landscape architects through their designs can actually, contribute to reduce this kind of, surveillance or control, which is going, which is creating a big voice in Europe and all.
I mean, that it's a very important thing that he has raised, Sanjay has raised. But why is the need for surveillance is, I think, the main question. Earlier, there was not. And, you also talked about how open spaces now kind of gets cordoned off and there's a limitation. So how do we delimit all of this? I think that we need to understand how our cities work in terms of how much more of poverty is increasing instead of actually decreasing. And there are more and more impoverished people on the streets, more and more people under mental stress. And if they are using these public spaces, there are lots of activities that happen which are of a nature which then kind of does not allow families to be using that. It deters the other kind of users from using this overall public space. So that's how I guess that whole surveillance business comes in. It's the kind of users that you really want to encourage because it's for the whole city. Whereas you raised the question of vandalism, in that I think a lot of things which are when we talk about landscape, I always feel that any wall actually takes away from nature. And so a wall in terms of blocks and concrete or man-made material can really be avoided when landscape architects design. And they can do that, a lot of that in plant material itself, because even in the plant material, you have so many things which can become so hardy that certain infiltration, it will not be allowed.
It is recognized that the more you, there is somebody who puts in place the surveillance. That small group of people, they become more and more alienated from society, which owns the space. If it's a public space, we own it. And we are to be spied upon just because they think that we are going to ruin some of their fixtures is something that Sanjay and I completely object.
It kind of just got reinforced here that landscape is in the eyes of the politicians and those in power. So I think it's now up to us how we use that, that recognition, and hopefully we should aim to do a good job of it.
Everybody, this has taken much longer than we had planned. So I'm really sorry. And we will see you again next week, Saturday, where we will have presentations from friends from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, shorter presentations, one person from Bangladesh, one person from Sri Lanka. Please join us again. And everybody who hasn't spoken this time, and Vinay is next to me, please raise your hand. Please speak the next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Aniket. Thank you, Aniket, for running good program.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And bringing people from all the SAARC countries together. That's really
जातोड़ो पटाड़ू मना